What's up? Today we're going to talk about how to respond to someone in your community, in your life, that is expecting a child with Down syndrome. So we got pregnant about a year ago, and we have her on the bed behind us. She's making sounds, so just don't mind her. But we got pregnant about a year ago, and at the 20-week mark, around there, we found out that she was going to have Down syndrome. We personally went through a lot of different emotions, feelings, thoughts right away, and so we can really only share from our own experience and from experiences that we've heard from other people or that we've read about. So obviously, we cannot speak for everyone in our situation, but I think we can give a pretty good idea of things to do and not to do. So I guess
Let's do it.
All right, let's get into it. So the first thing is to follow the parent's lead. And I kind of alluded to this a minute ago. At first, a lot of parents will go through grief. And I heard it worded one way that I really liked, and that is that people will kind of grieve the loss of having a normal or typical child. That is very normal. Not to say that everyone goes through it, but we definitely did. It was hard at first. There was a lot of crying. We didn't even know how to talk to people about it at first. We just needed time to kind of process it on our own, and we told people as we were ready. But by the time we started telling a larger number of people, we had already gotten to the point where we were accepting of her diagnosis. We were prepared for all of the challenges that we were going to face. We were excited just to have a baby in general. And so by the time we started telling people, we were kind of past the phase of grief. And I think that's something that's really important to remember. Now, of course, not everyone's going to do it that way, but we did.
And it's also kind of important to not only meet them where they're at in that stage, but also communicate with them in the way that they're communicating. Yeah. I know when we first started, I called my dad to tell him, but the rest of my family, I wanted them to know, I just texted them because I was not at a place where I felt like I could do that.
Yeah.
And slowly I got more comfortable with saying it out loud, with telling people in person. And it was just a process that, again, we didn't really have to, address those things at the time, but we could very easily just, text the information and call when we're ready and talk about it in person when we're ready. And it's always a good idea to know what they're comfortable with, so you're not trying to call them when they just texted you.
Right. I think another thing, I actually waited to make a big announcement until after she was already born, but I chose to do it through Facebook because, well, for one, that's just the fastest way to get information out these days. We have a guest. But basically, I felt like it would be better for me personally if people knew that she had Down syndrome before meeting her. I felt like people could kind of prepare their mindset and their responses beforehand so that they weren't surprised. I think a lot of people kind of say things in surprise that they wouldn't say otherwise, or they don't know what to say and then they feel awkward. And I kind of wanted to avoid a lot of that. So I just told people before. I wanted them to know before they met her. So that's how we personally did it.
So one thing that is also really important is when you are trying to find ways to maybe get some kind of advice across to your friends, your neighbors, coworkers, whatever it might be, it is better to offer the advice rather than offer a phone number. Specifically, I know a lot of people have a tendency to think, oh, well, I know someone else that's in that same situation. I might have a cousin or a friend who also has a kid who has Down syndrome. And a lot of them will offer, hey, here's their phone number. Why don't you call them? Or, hey, can I have your phone number so they can call you? And a lot of times that's just really awkward because it's a friend of a friend that you're going to call and you don't really know what to say. What is really helpful is when you have advice. A good example is my sister. She emailed me and she said, hey, David, her husband, David has a nephew who has Down syndrome. David's sister passed along some advice. Here's all of the advice that she passed along in an email. Because of that, we didn't feel the need to respond if we didn't want to. It was good advice that was really helpful to us. It was good to have that perspective, but it wasn't forced on us to have that interaction with someone we didn't know. It was our choice to either take the advice or leave it.
Yeah. And I think people just don't realize how overwhelming it can be. It seems like everybody knows somebody who has Down syndrome. And so if every single person in your life is saying, I know random person who has a child with Down syndrome or a sibling with Down syndrome or a whoever, it really can become overwhelming and you don't know who to reach out to or how to begin that process. I personally loved reading people's stories over having to reach out and contact someone. Now, this is something that actually I feel like other people may disagree with because they might really enjoy being able to talk out their emotions and their feelings with somebody who's gone through it before. I'm personally just of the mindset in general that I don't really share my feelings and look for advice from people that I don't know personally. I just find it really hard to get a good perspective from people who don't know me and my situation and what I'm going through. So yeah, that was just something that really was overwhelming for us, and we kind of felt bad because we knew these people had such good intentions and they wanted to help us, but I was just like, how do you expect me to like sort through all of this right away? It was just very overwhelming. I do have one good example as well of someone who reached out to me, and she said that she had a best friend who has Down syndrome, and so she reached out to that boy's mother, and the mother just gave a little bit of advice, really general things like to join Facebook groups and that it's okay to be feeling whatever I want to be feeling right now about it, and just different things like that. So I found that really helpful as well, and we definitely found both of those situations more helpful than anyone saying, would you like to be in contact with such and such person that you don't know?
And if you offer the advice instead of just offering the phone number, if there is someone that doesn't feel the same way that we do, then feel free to maybe say, if you want to be in contact with this person, there's no pressure, but here's their information. Give that opportunity to them so that it's still they can take it and leave it as they wish.
Right.
There's no pressure on them. They have the advice, but if they are not like us and they want to talk to someone like that, that offer is there too.
Right. So now I guess just getting into like more specific phrases, because I think this is really important to realize what you don't want to hear when you're in our situation versus what you do want to hear. So I think kind of the overarching thing we noticed was people saying, oh, I'm so sorry, when we would tell them. And it was kind of like, like I said earlier, when we started telling more people outside of our family, we had already come to a place of acceptance and joy over our child, and we didn't really need to hear, I'm sorry. I guess if you think about it this way, every parent will experience some type of grief over their child, whether their child gets sick, their child could get, very sick, they could get cancer, bad things happen to everybody, but you don't say, I'm sorry to any other expecting mom, over the potential grief that this child could cause her. people focus on the positives, like, oh, this will be such a good experience. You're going to love motherhood so much. Your child is going to be so sweet. They'll bring you so much joy. And to be honest, all of those things are true, even if you're having a child with Down syndrome or some other type of disability. For us, I think we just really appreciated when people would look toward the positives and say congratulations. You know, we would say, oh yeah, we found out she has Down syndrome, and people would say, well, you know, congratulations nonetheless. She will be a blessing to you. You know, things along those lines. We're definitely more positively impactful of our mindset than the negative things like, I'm so sorry, or I'll be praying for you guys. You know, at that point, we kind of felt like we didn't necessarily need prayers of encouragement, maybe prayers over her, you know, physical health, but definitely not prayers of encouragement at that time.
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of typical things that people say to you whenever you find out the diagnosis that aren't really the right things to say. Some of those things might be like special parents for special kids, or maybe they don't have it, or maybe it's a mild form. A lot of people also try to say things like, kids with Down syndrome are generally happier babies.
Yeah. I think just in general, the reason to not use those things are either because they are inspiring a hope that the child wouldn't have Down syndrome, again, casting it in a negative light, or they're just things that aren't true, or they're things that add pressure on the parents. And so we just stay away from those things. Mm. Particularly one that, thank goodness, I did not have to deal with this too much, but that is asking them, are you going to keep it? Now, I think if a parent comes to you crying about it, that is one thing, which I'm not going to say that it's right to do in that situation either. I just mean to contrast that to like a parent who is saying, oh yeah, we know that they're going to have Down syndrome, and is saying it without any negative emotion. There is absolutely no room for you then to say, are you going to keep this baby? Like, obviously, if they don't seem upset about it, then they are only going to find it offensive for you to ask that question. Even if they are crying and they are sad, it's still not a nice phrase to hear, because in that moment, you're basically saying to this parent, whether they are accepting of their child's diagnosis or if they are currently grieving the loss of a typical child, whatever stage they're in, you're basically telling that mother, your child is not as worthy of life as another child. You know, you would automatically assume that a person who was trying to get pregnant would keep that baby. But then when you hear that there's something wrong, quote unquote, with that child, if your immediate response is, are you keeping it? It's just a slap in the face. It just is. I mean, you're just like, you're saying, you know, normally I would never ask that question, but because your kid will be different, I feel like you need to justify the existence of your child. So that's something that I never wanted to hear, and I usually tried personally to kind of stop that in its tracks, because I would just say, you know, to healthcare professionals, I would say, you know, they would ask about the diagnosis, and I would say, yes, and we are choosing to proceed with these steps. We are choosing to not proceed with amniocentesis because no matter what, we're planning to, you know, keep the child. We're not going to put her up for adoption. We're not going to terminate. And I just stopped those questions before they could even come. With other people, it's not as straightforward as that, but I would still do the similar thing, you know, a similar thing to that sometimes, where I would just say, like, oh, you know, we got the diagnosis, and again, I didn't really tell a lot of people until we were already pretty accepting of it. So I would just express a lot of positive emotions, how excited I was, and just that we couldn't wait to meet her. So that made it very apparent right from the get-go that we were going to be keeping her. But I have heard stories from other moms who have had to deal with that extensively, and yeah, just across the board, it's not a good feeling. So instead, we tried to compile a list of things to maybe say otherwise, and those types of phrases would be things like, offering a prayer, especially for the child's physical health. But yeah, just in general, anything you would say to any other parent, congratulations, or we can't wait to meet them, or they will be such a blessing in your life, or to your family, something along those lines. Just things you would say to any other parents. So just a couple tidbits here at the end of things to try to avoid would be things like kind of what we mentioned earlier, like trying to put people in contact with others, but even more specifically than that, it's just saying like, oh, I know what you're going through, or here's facts about Down syndrome, blah, 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 because my cousin has it. Or because even worse would be like, oh yeah, my brother's cousins, friends, roommates, so on and so forth, they have a kid with Down syndrome, so basically I know what you're going through. Or so here's some advice, or whatever. Like, everybody thinks that they know something, and it's just really not helpful unless you've actually gone through the situation. And even then, every single parent is different, and every single child is different, Down syndrome or not. And just the fact is that just because you have a child with Down syndrome, or someone who has a child with Down syndrome, doesn't mean that you're going to respond to things the same way or process feelings the same way. So yeah, just those types of comments are not super helpful. So she needed a little bit of attention. My husband took our daughter in the other room, and I'm just going to finish up really quickly because we are so close to being done. So basically the last couple things we wanted to touch on were some grammatical, technical things, or just words, phrases in general to not use. Unless you're in the community, you may not realize that these things would be an issue. And to be honest, I won't even say that I take personal issue with all of these, but as soon as you have a child with Down syndrome, you're educated on these things. So I figured we could share those as well. So typically you don't refer to someone as Down syndrome. You don't say, oh, that Down syndrome baby, or that Down's baby. This is because no one person is Down syndrome. Down syndrome is not all that person is. So there's just a few reasons why you don't say that. Downs as a phrase is typically not seen as a pleasant term. So that's something that also can just in general be avoided. In the United States, I know that Down syndrome is preferred to Downs syndrome with an apostrophe S, because although Down syndrome is named after its founder, Downs apostrophe S comes from the name of the doctor that it's named after, or the researcher, whoever it was that found it, that discovered it. They are Down syndrome is named after them, but because that person did not have Down syndrome, nor do they own Down syndrome, in the US they choose to take the apostrophe S off and call it Down syndrome. And finally, honestly, this one I think goes without saying, but we obviously do not use the R word in general. So I will not call someone retarded as a synonym for calling someone stupid or ignorant, because to be honest, that is just rude to people who used to be referred to as mentally retarded. Obviously, retarded just means slow, and that's where that phrase comes from, but we don't use that word, colloquially to call other people that to mean like, oh, you're so stupid or something like that, because they obviously don't mean the same thing. Since it became a slang term in our society, medically, the politically correct terminology for it has changed. So someone who has Down syndrome is no longer referred to as medically or as mentally retarded, but instead they prefer, cognitive delays, like they have cognitive delays, or that they are intellectually disabled, things of that nature. So I feel like that one honestly goes without saying, but just in case you had never realized that or thought about it in that way, we figured we would throw that one in as well, because that is honestly one of the most offensive things you can do to you, or you can say to someone who is in this community. So that is really all we wanted to share with you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that this was helpful to those of you who are maybe expecting a child with Down syndrome, so that you can kind of start to normalize your feelings and emotions and know how to approach other people. Or if you know someone who is expecting a child with Down syndrome, I hope this was helpful to you as well, to get a little glimpse into what they're probably going through, what they might be feeling or thinking. So thank you so much, and I'll see you guys in the next one.